to our conference, and today you're going to talk about governance in Microsoft Teams, correct?
Yeah, that's
Okay,
correct.
just take the stage, mate, and
Yeah,
have a nice session.
will do. Thank you. Appreciate it.
I will,
Yes.
I will, by the way, I will moderate here the chat. So if I have
Yes.
some questions, do you want me to say the questions immediately, or do you want me to only in the end?
Yeah, I can. You can interrupt me. That's okay.
Yep.
Yeah, sure. No worries.
Okay, I
I
will
can,
do that.
could you make me an presenter so I can share the slides?
Oh, yeah.
That's me. Yeah.
That's you. Okay. Oops, sorry. Someone joined now, and your icon went. Oh, there you go. Make a presenter. There you go. There
Yeah.
you go, sir.
Perfect. Thank you. Let me check. I'll just do screen one. Move this one to the right so I can kind of see what's happening. Yeah, perfect. Okay. All right, so you're able to see my presentation? Just to be sure.
Yes, I can.
Yeah, perfect. Okay, great. Okay, well, good morning, everybody. Thanks for tuning in. I wish we could have done this in person. That would have been fantastic, of course, because I've also never been to Lisbon, so I definitely have to make a trip one time. Or unfortunately, I have to do it like this. Still appreciate, of course, everybody joining in on their Saturday morning. Of course, I want to thank the sponsors for making this event possible. We saw the introduction video, so Veeam and Pointfire, and of course, also the community. So a little bit about me. Yeah, I'm wearing a cap now because I didn't do my hair. Normally is what I look like. So my name is Jasper Oosterveld. I live and work in Amsterdam, the Netherlands, for a company called InSpark. And I work as a modern workplace consultant. So it's a bit broad title, of course, but my focus is not surprisingly Microsoft Teams and governance. And I also do a lot of compliance these days. So you have to think about classification, retention, data loss prevention. And I will also touch that today. And I'm also a Microsoft MVP. But enough about me. That's not what you're here for. So how do you set up a successful governance strategy for Microsoft Teams? So what we do, and this is something you can use as well, the slides will be available, so feel free to use it the way you want to. But we do it in 3 steps. So we start with a workshop, then we define the strategy, and last but not least, we also implement it. So this is what I will dive into a little bit more for the session today. But before I do that, I'm going to approach this the way I talk with my customers or our customers. So what I also I start to first talk a little bit more about Teams, because of course, most of the customers have heard about it, but not everybody is using it still. So I won't bore you with a demo, don't worry. I'll just keep this brief. But what I do, I first talk with them about what is Microsoft Teams. So I say, hey, Microsoft Teams is a hub for collaboration and communication. And I didn't come up with it myself. Microsoft does that. So, why reinvent the wheel, as they say? So what I say, it consists out of a couple pillars. The first one is chat. And the nice thing about chat is that you can really promote and stimulate an informal work culture. What that said, back home in the Netherlands, everything is mostly informal. So for us, that's already kind of natural, but there's still a lot of companies out there that are pretty formal. They use a lot of email for the communication. And just by using chat, it's just a lot more, it's also easier and it's more fun as well. I posted a GIF in the chat. It just makes it more informal and fun. And you definitely reduce email. But in the past, we just still send a lot of emails around, and especially if you start stimulating teams and do a lot of around adoption, you can definitely push more towards chat that will reduce your emails. That said, there's another issue, not really issue, but what I notice in Teams is the notification struggle. That's very real. And there are multiple ways to manage that. But if you're not careful, the frustration of email will be replaced with the frustration of notifications in Teams. So there are ways to do that. So that's something you can ask me what tips we do, but there are definitely ways to avoid that. So the next one is of course Meet. And that's basically what we're doing now as well. We're meeting virtually online, and I'm sharing my screen. You can all participate in the presentation. You can ask questions. Let's say you are at an office, or if you're lucky enough at home, you maybe have like a service hub. And then you can make notes in the whiteboard app, and that everybody can see the notes, the sketches, and it's saves. And it's just a lot more interactive and efficient than the traditional way of meeting and sharing the information. Well, the third one is calling, and that's really, I'm not talking about what we do now. I'm really talking about like the PBX system, like the call centers. Definitely not my expertise. So I'm never dive into this one with the customer. We have a partner who does that. So if they are interested in that, they can get in touch with them. But that's basically what this one is about. And the fourth one, of course, collaboration. So that's working together in teams, in for projects or departments. And it's just really a nice and efficient way to do that. All your content is stored in a central place. You don't have to send emails around with attachments. And you can also invite external people. If you do this right, it's really a nice way to collaborate with each other internally or externally. The last one, of course, is automate. And with that, we mean integrating your business processes within teams. The way we do that is, for example, well, we used to do that before this whole Corona thing happened, COVID thing happened. So at our office, you were able to participate in the company lunch. So the company bought in lunch, and you could participate in that, and then you have to pay a little fee. And it's not because they want to make a little money off us, but it's because of tax reasons. But before our back office colleague, she had to like write down who was having lunch. It's a horrible job. Like nobody wants to do that. It's not she can use her time a lot more efficient than that. So a colleague of mine, he made a bot. And the bot knows when you're at the office because it monitors the Wi-Fi. So it sees you using the InSpark Wi-Fi. It sends you a notification around 1 o'clock. Hey, I've noticed you're at the office. Did you participate in lunch? Now, then it's the honorary system. So you say yes or no. Of course, everybody is honest. So let's say I say yes. A signal is being sent to another system, an external system, actually, not a Microsoft system. And it's automatically deducted from my salary. It's just a small example, but there's so many more scenarios you can do by using Power Automate and Power Apps. And I believe there's some sessions around that, so definitely check those out. And you can make really nice things with that. So what I do after this, then I show a demo, and I'm not going to bore you guys with that, but I would advise to do that and just show, depending on the audience, like, let's say they've been working with teams for a while. Yeah, don't show how you do chat and everything because they're like, well, we know that. So kind of look at your audience and the familiarity with teams and then kind of do a demo. 15 minutes, but just show them the basics or maybe a little bit more depending on their expertise. And then I do a summary. And then this is basically showing the business value of teams. So I think one of the most valuable ones is that you really provide a central and integrated work experience. And what I mean with that is that, especially these days, you have Yammer in Teams. So I can go to my Yammer. I have my Outlook, so I can see my calendar. I wouldn't be surprised if in the near future we'll also be able to see our emails, for example, sort of like a webmail integration. SharePoint is coming that you can show your homepage. So what I basically can do, I can do most of my work, not everything, but most of it I can do within Teams. So I don't have to switch that much between multiple applications or browsers. What happens is that my concentration is longer because it's really distracting if you have to switch a lot. So that definitely increases my productivity. I find it hard to pinpoint exactly how much it is. It's always kind of like, hard to put a percentage with it. But I do notice if you work more in one application, it definitely increases my productivity. And there's still a lot of companies out there who want to push for a digital transformation. So going to the cloud, making sure they have the latest technologies, that can innovate. Teams is a cloud application, right? It's within Microsoft 365. So by using Teams, you automatically do that as well. Well, the last one is you are able to be compliant and secure. On one hand, of course, your data is safe in the data centers of Microsoft. But what I find really important and to make a distinction is what happens if the data is on your device. It doesn't matter if it's a desktop, a laptop, or a mobile. It's your responsibility. It's not Microsoft. You cannot go to Microsoft and say like, hey, my laptop has been stolen and now I lost my data. They provide tools to anticipate that and prevent that. So that's something we also touch a little bit on today, but I find it really important to make the distinction clear. That said, I am working from home, so it could happen that my family will come in maybe within the session. I hope not, but they can make a little bit of a noise, so so you're aware that can happen. So they are aware I'm doing this session, but you're not a little kid, so they're hard to control around that aspect. So once I've done this, so I've talked about Teams, I did a demo, the advantages, business value. I asked them, what are some of the worries you're now maybe anticipating by seeing this? So maybe you are going to use Teams. What are your worries? And what I noticed is that are basically the same ones these days. I don't really see any new ones. So they are afraid for an explosion of teams, that so many teams are created, it will become hard to manage. And that's really a reasonable worry. There's also the worry of duplication, because you are probably aware that if I go to Teams and I create a new one, Teams doesn't tell me, hey, you are creating a marketing team. That one already exists. Unfortunately, it doesn't do that. So you get a duplicate, and that can also make it more hard to manage and make it difficult for users to actually find the right team they want to participate in. The purpose can be very unclear, especially if there's not really a proper naming convention or people give strange names to teams. Yeah, it's also for IT, it can be hard to manage. It's like, hey, what is this team actually being used for? But also for the business users, it can be hard to know, like, hey, is this the team I'm looking for, or what's going on here? Findability, they are finally improving the search within Teams, but still for now, it's not easy to find a team. It's not really like, it doesn't have like a, how do you call it? Yeah, like I really have to find, like we use expert teams, and let's say I have an expert team called the compliance. If I type in compliance, it won't find a team. So like a wildcard search, it doesn't have that. So that's very difficult. Complexity, and that one was an interesting one because I didn't thought about them when the customer said to me like, hey, you're showing me now how you can create a team. There's a lot of options, and that's actually true. Like if you go to Teams and you have two options from beginning, it says, do you want to create a team from scratch, or do you want to make it based on a previous one? And that, and it talks about a Microsoft 365 group, and it's not always that easy to understand, especially for the less technical people among us. And the last one, of course, again, especially these days, everybody works from home. There's a lot of collaboration with people outside of the company. Yeah, there's a lot of worries about a data leak, especially for a person who has the CISO function, or is responsible for the data classification and data policies, information protection policies. It's a reasonable risk, a worry, and a risk. So let's say you don't address these, you implement it anyway, you don't do any governance. There are two things that can happen. And again, these are not shocking. I think you probably see them, you're like, okay, that makes sense. Is of course a failed user adoption. People get frustrated, they can't find anything, they don't really understand what's happening, they can't really use it. And that's a huge shame, because if you use Teams properly and you do good governance and adoption, it can be a fantastic service for within your company or for your customers. And the last one, of course, it can also really increase the maintenance for IT. They get so many questions from the business users, and there's maybe such an explosion of teams, they don't really know how to manage it. So there's also two reasons you really need to work on governance. So the next step is, again, they kind of already see it, but I still want to tell them, like, hey, why is governance and governance strategy so important? Not just for a rollout, but also for continuing to use Teams for a long period of time. And again, maybe you're wondering, like, hey, my customer or the company I work for, we've already been using Teams. Is it too late? It's never too late to do a governance strategy. It's never too late. Maybe you need to go back and maybe adjust some settings, but it's never too late, right? That's something I want to give to you as well. So why is it important? 4 things. First one is you really need to connect IT with business. Especially in the olden days, there was a lot of like a distance between these two groups. There was a lot of misunderstanding, frustration, irritation. That has definitely become less, but there's still not a lot of understanding what each group really wants and what is important for them. For example, the business just wants to collaborate, right? They want a place where they can store their files, where they can work with colleagues, external people, and the IT wants that too. It's not like they're like, no, we don't want you to do that, but they have other responsibilities, right? They have to think about how to manage it. They have to think about the whole compliance aspect. So if you bring those two together, there will be a lot of more understanding and a lot less communication mistakes along the line. Well, the next one is adoption. If you start with your governance strategy, you'll make a lot of decisions that will impact the way you're going to execute your adoption strategy, right? For example, are we allowed to work with external people? If so, how are we able to do that? So, for example, there's a lot of responsibility for owners of a team. they are the ones who are actually able to invite external people. So within adoption, you have to communicate that. You have to teach them about the responsibilities. So these two go hand in hand. So not just only do adoption and no governance and vice versa. You really have to do both. Now, the third one is there are a lot of every company has their own procedures, right? How do you request a collaboration environment? Are you able to work with external services, for example? If you just turn on Teams and don't do anything, by default, you're able to use a lot of third-party apps. And that's not definitely, by definition, wrong, but it can be a risk, and maybe it cannot match the internal procedures. It's the same for law and regulation. As in Europe, we have GDPR, for example. Well, Microsoft provides a lot of help with that you can monitor it and make sure it's also being compliant with it. But if you don't do anything, it doesn't do it automatically. You have to take some steps for that. And what can happen is that maybe people share content or chat that is not actually allowed, or it needs to be automatically deleted after a certain amount of time. So that's something that's really important. You really have to look at as well. And don't worry, I will talk about all of these things a little bit more in depth. And the last one, this one is a little bit more technical for the business users, but for IT, this one is very crucial. Because if you create a team, it's not just a team, right? In the background, a Microsoft 365 group is created that is basically a security group in Azure AD. It contains people, and those people are divided between owners and members. But it's not just that. I also get a SharePoint team site. I get a group in Stream. I get a plan and planner. There is a connection available with Power BI, and I'm probably forgetting a couple more. So there's a lot happening in the background. One side for IT, right? A lot of stuff happens. Like I forget Exchange, right? So let's say if an Exchange admin, he or she is like, where are all these mailboxes coming from? You know? And it's like, if you don't do anything with that, that can lead to miscommunication and maybe accidental deletion of certain teams. So next up, you start with the workshop. So I'm going to talk about all the steps of all the topics, but I'm only going to go in depth around one. That's the Microsoft Teams workload. Otherwise, I'm never going to make it on time. But the first thing you have to do, you have to define the scope. So what is the scope of your Microsoft Teams governance? The most common one is collaboration in with a group of people. That's the most common one. But it can also be, for example, setting up a call center, right? That will be the scope of your governance. You need to define your vision and goals. Why are we doing this? What is the purpose of using Microsoft Teams? What are we trying to achieve? And you can reuse that from your adoption plan, or you can define it here and then use it there. But you use this to explain to your colleagues or to your customer, this is why we are using Teams and this is the business value for you. Okay. The next one is a steering committee. You can give it a different name. You can call it governance board or whatever. What I'm trying to say is that you need to have a group of people who actually monitor the decisions you took in your governance strategy. Make sure they're actually that people follow them, right? And you also need to adjust your governance strategy. Imagine you define a governance strategy in January, and then in March there's a lockdown because of COVID. That has a huge impact on your Microsoft Teams usage and rollout. How are you going to manage that, right? And on the other hand, how are you going to manage, for example, the changes Microsoft makes? Roles and responsibilities, also very important. Who are your administrators, right? So these are more the technical roles. What are the roles around owners, members, and guests in Teams? What are the roles around SharePoint, right? But also departments. What departments are related to your rollout of Teams, your usage of Teams? What are their responsibilities? And this is mainly done to prevent miscommunication and also to help people out. Like, hey, I have a question. Okay, I need to contact this department or this person. This is the one we'll talk a little bit more about, so I'll skip it for now. Processes and procedures. This is one, for example, how are you managing people who are new to a company, who switch a job or switch a department, who leave the company? How are you making sure they have the right license? They maybe are automatically added to a department team, or their license and permissions are automatically redacted, right? It's very crucial. And the last one is, how do you manage the new features and updates from around Microsoft Teams? Unfortunately, Microsoft Teams is not part of targeted release, but that said, there's still a lot of other ways you can anticipate change. For example, the message center in the Office 365 Admin Center is very valuable these days. Microsoft is publishing a lot of information there, so you need to have at least one or two people who monitor that frequently and then see what's happening, what's coming, and then maybe set up some communication materials, maybe set up some training sessions, right? But that's very crucial. So this is the one we'll talk a little bit more about. No, not a little bit. This is the one we talk more about. This is a long list. I don't know, maybe it doesn't sound too exciting, but this is very crucial. You discuss all of these items. It's very crucial. So the first one you start with is basically defining your collaboration templates. Because again, most customers, they don't just use Teams for a team. They use it for multiple purposes: to work in projects, to work with their customers, to have cross-department collaboration, or maybe for their own teams, etc. and etc. So the first thing you need to do is define the collaboration templates. Don't define 10, because then it will be too overwhelming. Yeah. So keep it small. They need what you do now. So that you define your collaboration templates. Now, per template, you're going to define a naming policy if that's applicable. So, for example, what you can define is that we want to use projects, and then each time a project is created, a project team is created, it needs to have an abbreviation, a dash, and then the name of the team. That's an option. There's still also a lot of customers who would like to have a naming convention for the URL in SharePoint. Unfortunately, that is something you have to do with provisioning. That's not something you can do in a different way. But I just added an example here. It's not mandatory, but it can be, and there's some customers who require that. So there are a couple of options to do a naming convention. One has been available for a long time, is do it with an AAD policy, where you can add a word that you specify and use an AAD property as a prefix, so before the name of the team or after. To be fair, I've never seen this being used, and I'll tell you a little bit later why that is. You can create your own provisioning solution or you acquire one. There are a lot of companies out there who have that. You can leave it up to the employees. You say like, well, we do more of a self-service scenario where people can just create their own team, and then we'll ask them, can you apply a naming policy? Well, I think you already know that's not going to happen, but it is an option. Again, you also don't have to do it. It's not always necessary. So don't feel forced that you have to do it. A couple of advantages and challenges. So the advantages is that you definitely increase the findability, because what I discussed before, finding teams now is not that easy. Well, if you want to use an AAD policy, you really need to have an up-to-date AAD, and that's not always the case. Especially if you define multiple collaboration templates, it's not that easy to find a word that matches all of these templates. And again, if you leave it up to employees, they will just forget, and they don't do it on purpose to bully you or to frustrate you. It's just when you're just in a rush or something, you're not going to remember to set a naming policy. So what I advise is only apply when it's really necessary. And I have a good example from one of our customers. They have it was a local district, and they shared their Office 365 tenant with a couple other districts in the neighborhood, and a couple external companies. So for them, doing a naming policy was very useful, because it immediately showed, hey, this team belongs to this district or belongs to this company. So especially for IT, easier to manage, and for the business users, easy to recognize where this team belongs to. So in that case, it made perfect sense. But sometimes it just doesn't make sense, and it's just not necessary. Next up is external access. So again, a couple options. Very straightforward. You can allow it for all teams. You can say, I allow it, but just for a selection of teams. I disable it for all teams. Or these days, you can also decide it with a sensitivity label. And I'll show you an example about that later on. Again, some advantages and challenges. You definitely reduce shadow IT, because let's be fair, all of our collaboration these days is mostly with external people. Not all the time, but mostly is. If you block that, they will find a different way. They will start emailing. Then maybe you'll set up a Box account or Dropbox or whatever, and then it's completely out of your reach what's happening. And it's just more efficient too. If you just provide it and facilitate it within your own Teams environment, it will make your business users happier as well. That said, if you do this, it's very crucial that you look at compliance, because you need to invite an external person, so then he or she has access. That's true. But that's just one level of your security, because after that, he or she can just download everything and just like have it on their laptop and a USB stick, share with other people. And that's not something you would always want, right? So that's why it's crucial you look at data classification and DLP. More about it later. It is also a bit more of a responsibility for owners, because they are basically the ones that are able to invite external people. And these days, owners are people from within the business. And I still advise that, makes more sense, but it does mean you really have to teach them and explain them what the responsibility is around this topic. So what do I advise? So I hope you see a little bit of a structure, right? I tell you the topic, what it is, the options and the challenges and the advantages, and then my advice. And this is just based on what I've been doing for the last couple of years. So looking at external access, I do advise to turn this on for all teams. I know some people think like, oh, that's not possible. Hold on for a moment. But that said, if you do this, if you go to this route, please set up something to manage it. So one way to do that is, for example, work with Azure Access Reviews. What is an Azure Access Review? Well, it's a little bit already in the title. What you do, you set up an access review. It's not a surprise, but you set up a review policy, and you connect a couple teams to that policy. And within that policy, you basically define the time period where the owners have to review the membership of that team. So that can also be internal people or external people or both. And they basically get an email saying like, hey, it's now time to review these teams. And then you can select people you want to keep or basically kick out of the team. It does acquire a little bit more of an expensive license, Azure ADP2. And right now, it's not really the flexible solution, because you need to manually add, if you don't use any custom development, of course, you need to manually add or remove teams from the policy. So it's not always the easiest way. A little bit easier one is applying social control. Imagine you're in a department team and you see that a colleague of yours is inviting external people, and it's something you can see in the information panel, or you just see it in membership. And it's like, hey, why are there guests here? This is our department team. That we shouldn't have external people in here, and you can address that. A huge part is, of course, the education of your team owners. And starting with compliance and data classification. Start with compliance existing out of data classification and DLP. Now, then again, next up. So we defined our templates. Then we define per template if there's a naming policy required, external access per collaboration template, and now our expiration policy. So with an expiration policy, we can basically say after this period of time, so it can be a month or 6 months or a year, the system is going to check, is there still activity, yes or no, and then it will automatically delete if the owners agree with that, the team. So you can say, I want to apply an expiration policy for all teams, a selection, or none. So what will happen is that as if there's no activity, me as an owner will get an email and saying like, hey, do you want to keep this team or do you want to delete it? Well, I think they call our guy for deletion, one of the two. What will happen is if I don't reply, 15 days later, before the expiration of, for example, the 6 months after the team has been created, then 15 days later, I again get a notification. If I don't reply, it's 1 day before, and after that, it will be automatically deleted. Before, like a while back, owners used to get this email anyway, even if the team is being used. That's now being prevented with an activity check, so that the system again checks if there's any activity around files, or if people are actually at all visiting channels. So again, some advantages are that you can keep your tenant clean, so to speak, right? You're not stuck with maybe dozens or hundreds of unused teams. And it makes it easier for IT, because you move the management from your end as IT more to the business, because they can decide, I want to keep it, yes or no. So what are some challenges? Let's say it is deleted. If you don't set up any additional backup servers, after 30 days, everything is gone. So not just the team, the chat, but the planner, the stream, the SharePoint where all your content resides, maybe the workspace in Power BI, it's all gone. Because the owners basically decide, it's a huge responsibility for them. And that's also where the adoption part kicks in, because that's where the education part is very important. Of course, you also need to think about your retention policies, and I'll talk a little bit more afterwards, but that can also help you in preventing the accidental deletion of valuable content or chat. So I advise to turn it on for a year, and then you can reevaluate, is this too long, or or I can bring it back maybe to like 6 months. Definitely apply retention policies or define those to prevent that unwanted data loss. That a team is not accidentally, but an owner decides to delete a team, but a team actually contained content that had to be preserved for maybe 6-7 years according to certain regulations. Next up, backup and restore. As I said, a team that's deleted is stored for 30 days in a recycle bin. Channels have also a recycle bin of 30 days. Content has the 93 days in SharePoint. And the last one is the videos in Stream. A quick note, just the storage of recordings you make in Teams will be moved to OneDrive and SharePoint. So that does increase the length, because then it will be the 93 days from the SharePoint. But for now, it's still this one. So what do I advise? You just have to check, like, is what I just mentioned in the previous slide, is that sufficient? Most of the times it is. There are not that many customers who are like, oh, that doesn't work for us, but it can happen, right? So you need to review it, discuss it with your customer or internally, and also match it with regulations and internal agreements. Maybe there are really strict backup policies within your company. Yeah, then you need to look at external options. So for example, AvePoint, I also saw the video of Veeam. I'm not trying to promote AvePoint. It's just the only one I've seen in action. It'll look really good. So I just advise you to just shop around. See a couple of vendors who will provide an additional backup service and see if that works for you. Just be aware, it has additional cost, of course, because they need to store all your content somewhere in their Azure environment. So it costs something. And again, apply your retention policies. So the next one is privacy. What does the default privacy need to be of your collaboration template? Private, so that means only the owners are available to invite members and other people cannot find it. There was a great option available actually where the owner was able to say, hey, I know my team is private, but I don't mind if people find it. I don't know why, but Microsoft put that one on hold. That's also in the documentation. I'm expecting it to come back in the future. I hope soon, because it is a nice feature. But just be aware that it is now gone. Hopefully it will come back one day. The next one is public. So that basically means everybody can join the team. And the third one is org-wide. It's a little bit comparable to Yammer. You can create 5 org-wide teams and it will automatically add all your internal employees. To be fair, I've never seen that being used with one of our customers. I think one has it actually, but that's it. Important, some advice from my end is that I always advise try to be open by default to improve knowledge sharing, reuse of content. But of course, there are always teams that's not possible, like the board of directors, for example, or HR. But that's fine because it's open by default, but it doesn't mean it always has to be open. If and this one is a little, I wrote this sentence down, I was like, this one is going to be confusing. But let's say you're not using a label, owners can always change the privacy. But if you define the privacy with a sensitivity label, more about that later, you cannot go back because it's automatically pushed by the label. But otherwise, if you don't use any labels to classify your teams, owners can always switch. But I don't think with org-wide though. I think once you go org-wide, there's no way to go back. So labels. So traditionally, labels, sensitivity labels, have been used to classify your content. For example, a presentation or an email or a PDF or a Word document. But since this year, you're able to extend it to Teams, SharePoint team sites, or just Microsoft 365 groups in general. I'll show you a couple of screenshots so you have a little bit of an idea what it looks like. So when you define your label, you have a couple options. You can say this team with this label is always public or always private. And this is where you cannot switch back. you cannot switch between these two anymore because it's defined within the label options. This is nice. You can also say, hey, when this label is applied, external access is automatically blocked or it's allowed. Announced at Ignite will be a preview that you can also define your sharing links. So you can say anyone can share, you can share this with anyone, only new and existing users, existing guests only, or no external sharing at all. And maybe it's a little bit of an overlap with the previous one, but the previous one basically defines you cannot invite anybody within your team. This one is really about sharing content. This one is a bit of an overlap with conditional access and mobile device management. You can also say with this team, with this label, if somebody doesn't have a managed device, he or she cannot access the content at all, only within the browser, or he or she will have full access. If you want to use this, please discuss this with the customer or the person within the company who is responsible for these conditional access and mobile device management policies, because it's a bit of an overlap. Yeah, this is also really important. Don't expect the label you apply to a team automatically is applied to the content. Those two things are separate. So let's say you have a template, let's say you have a label called highly confidential. It doesn't mean that, and that means if that label is applied that only people within your company can access the files. That's not going to be automatically applied to all the files being stored in that team. I don't know if they'll ever do that in the future. On one hand, it makes sense, but on the other hand, it can always lead to annoying situations. So, but it is something to be very aware of. So what does this look like actually? So this is a screenshot of the settings. So I can create my label, and then I can say I want to use this label for files and emails and or groups and sites. But now you can also just create a label just for groups and teams. Sites, teams. Microsoft really needs to work on those naming on those names. It's very confusing. But just groups and sites, and in our case, it's just teams. So then you can say, hey, what options do I want to apply? So do I want to apply protection settings? So this is, for example, the external users, or what kind of protection settings do I want to have for my site? So that's the unmanaged devices part. Oh, yeah, so my family is going to come in. So I warn you, there's going to be a little bit of crying already here. So I really apologize. It's not distracting at all. So here's an example of the privacy setting you can do. You can tick a box for external user access. And here you can define the unmanaged devices settings. What does this look like? So imagine I have a sensitivity label called project. A little bit of crying going on. No, it's fine. I already warned them. So I select my label project. Then you can see I can only select private. You see the option public is already grayed out. If I want to invite an external person, for example, my own, probably need a little break.
I was just saying that working from home and presenting from home is awesome, right?
I'll wait a minute.
No worries. I think everyone will understand. I think most of us have kids and already.
Yeah.
Worry about it.
It's fine. It's fine. It's very sad. Ah, there we go. Sorry. So let's say I said, hey, there's no external access allowed. This is what happens. I just don't really like the message, because it would be nicer if it said you're trying to add an external person, but it's not allowed because of the policies. Now it's just kind of vague why it doesn't work. This is just an example of what will happen if I have an unmanaged device and I'm trying to access the content. So what do I advise around this area? So it's definitely interesting to use with the self-service scenario, where you allow your users to assign labels to the teams they're creating. I'm also internally trying to look if you can combine this with a provisioning solution. But you definitely have to define your labels in a separate project. because especially if your customer or internally you don't have this yet, because it's not huge, but it's quite a process. And if you try to include this in your whole governance workshop and strategy, it will just become too long. But it is crucial, so definitely set it up an additional project. Maybe there are some customers who already have this in place. Perfect, you can just include it in your document you're writing. DLP. So DLP is two things. So it can prevent the sharing of chat, prevent the sharing of sensitive information in chat. So this can be, for example, somebody's adding a credit card number or a social security number. And DLP works with sensitive information types. Microsoft provides a whole lot. So these are the common ones, right? So what I said, credit card, but it can be like social security number, et cetera, et cetera. You can also define your own, because maybe you want to define a sensitive information type that's related to a very important project you're doing. That's also possible. Still crying. Let's see. So you can also do it for documents. So it can recognize, hey, you're uploading a document with a credit card number that is not allowed because of this policy. So this can be for internal, but also external, because maybe your policies are like, oh, it's fine if we share a credit card number internally, but if we notice this is with external people, we block it. For chat and DLP, you need an E5 license. And I have the feeling, because that's not the case for the content, so I have the feeling this has been an upsell opportunity for Microsoft. So again, what does this look like? So imagine you're creating a Word document in the browser, and I start adding, in this case, it's an IBAN number, a banking number, for an international banking number. It will automatically pop up. So it'll give me a policy tip saying like, hey, this message or item is blocked due to the presence of this IBAN code. And that's a message you can define yourself. So this is just one I created. This is what it looks like if you upload a document directly into SharePoint. You get a little nice red symbol basically showing you, look, hey, something is up. You click on it, you again get a similar message saying like, hey, it's blocked. And if you click on the policy tip, you get a little bit more information. And here again, you can define the text. And then what's nice is that you can include two options. You can say you allow your users to report an issue, basically saying like, hey, I don't know why this is happening. Or you can allow them to override it with a justification. Because again, there can be a case that maybe the DLP policy is triggered when it should not be triggered. Because it's a sensitive service, believe me. It doesn't always work the way you expect it to work. So this allows your users to override it with a justification. Don't worry, the justification is logged. So there's really a nice dashboard. I don't have a screenshot, but there's a nice dashboard of DLP where everything is registered, if the policies are triggered and if people are overriding it. And definitely allowing like a CISO to monitor this, or somebody else who's responsible for the security within your company organization. This is what it looks like in Teams, very similar. I add some text, again with a IBAN number, it immediately blocks it. Again, a message, this is the reason why it's blocked, and the same option to override it or report it. So what do I advise? Yeah, just look at your internal regulations and, internal procedures and regulations like GDPR, and then match that the way you're going to use Teams. Yeah, I have to do a lot of testing. This was a hard lesson for me. I had a customer with a relatively easy use case, and I thought like, hey, this is perfect for DLP. Didn't turn out to be like that. You often really have to tweak that sensitive information type. It's really not always that easy. So please, before you implement this in production, do a lot of testing so you're almost 100% certain it works the way you expect it to work, or the customer expects it to work. Yeah, what you see, there's a lot of notifications popping up, right? You get error messages, people can override, they can complain. Yeah, you need to educate them and inform them this is happening. Don't turn it on, because you'll get a, I want to say shitload, will say it anyway. Well, people will really be really angry at you that this is happening because they don't understand. And define and implement in a separate project if it doesn't exist, because it can be too large, and yeah, your whole project for setting up a Microsoft Teams governance strategy will just kind of explode. Relatively straightforward. You can again, it's in the Word. You can retain content, so documents or chat, for an X amount of period, so that it can be days, months, or years. Or you say, yeah, I want to retain it, but I also want to automatically delete it after, for example, 6 months. I believe a resume, I've done this session a couple of times. I really have to look it up, so I'm 100% certain. But I believe you have to delete it after 3 months or 6 months or something like that. So that can be a use case. Like, hey, please detect any resumes that are being created or shared within Teams, and then apply this retention policy, and then automatically delete it after a year, for example. And I believe that's only when people don't work for you, of course, because otherwise you should be able to keep the resume. You can also say, hey, I don't mind if people edit it or whatever, just delete it automatically after a year, for example. For now, retention for chat in private channels is not supported. This is exactly the same advice as DLP. Again, match it, do a lot of testing, educate and inform, and implement it in a separate project. So maybe you've been wondering, like, hey, when is he going to talk about the whole creation process? Like, how am I allowed to create those templates? Who is allowed to do that? The reason I do this last is because all these topics I just discussed basically define how you're going to set up your creation process. A couple options. You can, of course, allow all your employees to create teams through the Teams application. You can also allow a selection of them, but you still do the self-serve. You still allow people to go to Teams. It's just a selection of people. And this is still the most common one, is you do it more in a controlled manner, through a provisioning solution, where people have to go, for example, to an app in Teams or to a form in SharePoint site, and they have request their collaboration template. And maybe it can be automatically created, but maybe there needs to be an approval process. This is very important. I said all times important because everything is important, but there's not really a right or wrong. Like it's not like if you do self-service, you're doing completely wrong. It just really depends on your requirements. That's it. It depends on your requirements or your customer's requirements. What impacts this? Are you using multiple collaboration templates? Because if you often do, it's not that easy to use this in a self-service scenario, because a team is just a team. Microsoft is introducing Teams templates. It's rolling out now, where you can define your own templates. So let's say that's the only requirement you have, that there's a distinction that somebody picks a project or a department, and you have a couple of preset channels, some settings, and then team templates could work. Maybe you really have the strict naming policy, like the example I discussed about the local district. Yeah, then for now you're just stuck to like a provisioning solution. And again, that's fine. It's not a big deal. Or you have strict external access policies, or you have really different expiration policies per template. Yeah, all these examples can lead to a provisioning solution. That's the collaboration template part. And then of course Teams quite a lot of settings that implement all teams, right? So you have to go to the administration center of Teams and take a look at the policies that are defined there and see if you need to make changes to that. So there can be, for example, I'm such an idiot, I should have removed this. That's the Discover Private Teams. That's the one I talked about briefly. That's the one that's not available anymore. So imagine that out of this slide. But you can say like, hey, only this department or these 5 people, only they are allowed to create private channels, or use the default where everybody's allowed to do it. You can define your messaging policies. Maybe you don't want to use GIFs. Maybe you don't want to use stickers. That can happen. Then you just can, again, define your policy where you change that. Maybe there's something called read receipts, where you see if somebody's actually read your chat. I hate that, but this is personal. Who is allowed to use add apps? What apps are allowed? Am I allowed to use all those third-party apps? Or maybe I turn it off and just allow a couple of them. Settings, a couple of overall settings. Are you going to allow use tagging, for example? Are you going to allow the integration of third-party file apps, storage apps, like Box, Dropbox, and a couple more? I believe it's still on by default, but what will happen is in the files section of Teams, you can add your own Dropbox account. Now that's not something you always want, so that you can turn it off within the admin center. Ooh, a whole list, right? Yeah, it's a lot of work. This is not something you do in an hour, because it's just a whole checklist you have to basically go over with internally or with your customer. Once you've done that, get an agreement on all the topics I just discussed. Add these in a document, or maybe a PowerPoint presentation, or maybe in a SharePoint page, but you need to have it. You need to have it somewhere so you can refer to it and review it. What I do, I present the findings So I have a meeting with the customer, and I have a PowerPoint presentation where I basically go over the most important decisions. And then often there's a review process included, but then eventually you need to finalize it. It's like, hey, it's now, what is it? No, the 10th of October. This is for now our governance strategy. But again, I mentioned in the beginning, you need to have a steering committee who was like maybe on a monthly basis reevaluating your strategy. Do we need to make changes? Yes or no? So we've done that. Then we're at the last step. Yeah, you probably need to make some adjustments in your configuration, right? Maybe that example I gave of third-party apps, yeah, maybe that needs to be disabled, so you have to turn it off. Yeah, again, maybe you have to implement a governance solution for example, maybe the provisioning. So AvePoint has one, for example. There are multiple other ones who have it as well. Maybe you're going more for a self-service scenario, and that's where ShareKit Apricot can be very useful. That's it. So that again, it's yeah. I hope you've seen how important. So how important, why you should do governance, what's part of it, and then the steps you can take. Yeah. So yeah. Again, thanks for attending. I'm sorry about the crying. I knew it was going to happen, but that's why I mentioned it a little before it actually happened. These are my contact details, so feel free to reach out to me if you have any additional questions. You can use the content I discussed. And I hope you have a lot of success on your governance journey. I also included a couple resources, so a link to the new Teams templates. There are a lot of Ignite sessions available online. Definitely check those out. A couple links to the Microsoft Information Protection, where they discuss a lot of the things I also talked about today. Yeah, and of course, before I finish, and I'll check if there are any questions, thanks to the sponsors again for making this possible.
Yeah, we have